Tonight, we want to open dusty chronicles to list the names of kings or measure the weight of sagas. Instead, we'll begin at the roots of Yggdrasil, the world ash, where the soil folds over itself like a sleeping animal, and the roots reach deeper than memory. Here, in the stillness between breaths of wind, stories whisper about hidden bridges, paths not drawn on the maps of gods, crossings older than thunder and quieter than snow. Some were said to be nothing more than planks blackened by centuries, others threads of light laid across emptiness like frost on a pond. There are tales of ravens circling certain routes, calling in a pattern that only the patient could hear, a language of direction spoken in wings and echoes. Travelers claimed the bridges revealed themselves only when you stopped looking for them, when your steps fell into the rhythm of the earth itself. So lower the lights. Let the night settle around you like a slow tide. And if your breathing begins to match the rustle of leaves across an unseen path, that's just the story carrying you with it. If quiet journeys like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next campfire will be waiting for you there. And beyond that firelight, where the wind carries only half-remembered words, the first steps wait in silence. They lead toward roots older than memory, where bridges glimmer faintly between worlds' paths that rise and vanish like breath on cold air. Follow them carefully. Some return you to familiar ground. Others do not. At the base of the world ash, the roots twist like sleeping serpents, and in the hush between their breaths, there are rumors of crossings so old that even the moss has given up on remembering their names. The stories say these were not grand arches, but modest things, the sort of bridges you'd only find if you were already walking slowly, the way one does in the dark when there's a rag somewhere on the floor and you keep trying to guess where it starts. Some were wooden planks black with age. Some were slivers of light laid across gaps like frost on a puddle. A few were nothing more than a row of evenly spaced stones that felt warmer than they should have when you stepped on them. People claim that ravens remember certain turns of route, that if you tilt your head just so when one calls, the sound outlines a path. It is uncertain whether the ravens do this on purpose or simply because being a raven is a very busy profession, but the bridges arrive under the feet of those who listen. When the gods drew their maps, they colored Bifrost with the obvious rainbow crayons and wrote its name in particularly proud letters. They did not always bother to pencil in the quieter ways. There were ice ladders that rattled gently out toward Jotunheim and made a useful musical note when the wind played them like a harp. There were narrow stone ribbons that threaded down toward Hell, more like cautiously extended fingers than roads, careful not to wake what lay beneath. And there were thin planks stretching to Alfheim, pale as birch bark, and etched with a design of leaves that looked different from one day to the next. As though some patient person was keeping a diary in veins of wood, messengers used these bridges. So do people whose lives depended on getting somewhere just slightly off to the side of everything. Traders led cautious ponies, and hunters stepped onto paths that carried their boots so softly that snow never squeaked under them again. If Bifrost is the trumpet announcing an arrival, these other crossings are the gentle cough you make in a library to let someone know you re there. The forgotten paths seem to have been practical rather than heroic, which in Norse stories feels almost rebellious. There was a plankway Arch 7B that no one named properly because it refused to remain in a single place. It circled the same 3 routes in a very slow pattern, like a busy person going back to the kitchen because they can't quite remember what they were meant to fetch. Sailors swore there was a light bridge that skimmed across a calm lake at certain hours before dawn, and that fish being contrary would leap onto it and slide like children on polished floors, making a sound otherwise only heard from newly finished sleds. A shepherd in an old verse insists that stepping on one of these spans smells faintly of beeswax and salt, as if it were a shrine or a cupboard, but that may just mean the poet was hungry when writing it. The bridges did not shout about themselves, and when people forgot them, they did not complain. Some historians would call them liminal. The Norns might label them miscellaneous. I prefer to think of them as the passages, used by those who keep a quiet schedule and like to arrive exactly on time while appearing to have materialized from nowhere. Of course, not all bridges were built by the gods who preferred craftsmanship with a warranty. In the misty stretches where hill shadows become something else, the giants left odd crossings behind. These were not beautiful. They were sturdy in the way a rock is sturdy, which is to say, indifferent to your opinion. There are accounts of a bone and stone causeway that appeared during a moonless night and wandered across a river like a sleepy cow, waiting where it pleased. Travelers crossed in single file with that careful politeness reserved for narrow staircases and precarious ladders. When they looked back from the far bank at first light, the water was smooth and ordinary, and the bridge was gone as if snoring had erased it. Some claimed the giants used such tricks to move quietly because even giants enjoy a day without paperwork. Others whispered that these were traps meant to lead mortals into wilderness pockets that didn't bother to wear a season. It is also possible the giants built the bridges simply because they could and because a straight line has a certain rude charm at midnight. The troll-built crossings were even less predictable. Trolls are excellent at architecture when they forget they are building something, which happens more often than one might think. A row of boulders becomes a causeway if you push them with your shoulder while thinking about soup. A spine of iron roots, hammered without a plan, will often point to somewhere you did not know you needed to be. There is a note in a late manuscript explaining that one famous bridge would accept only goats and those who could name 3 kinds of moss. You might say that is an unreasonable toll, but in fairness, the goats paid nothing. The night fog hid these bridges and revealed them with equal enthusiasm. Many tales end with the traveler announcing that they are merely going to check the first few stones to see if they wobble. A statement that has the same energy as, "I'll just read one more page," before sleep gently categorizes you as a person who is done making choices for the day. And then there were the elven pathways lit by starlight, the most polite of all the crossings. They gleamed under constellations like thin threads stretched from needle to needle. By daylight, the paths were as absent as a dream that leaves only the sense of having been somewhere with the right temperature. Mariners said that when the sky was clear and the water held very still, a silver trace ran across the lake's surface. And if you steered your boat so that its bow did not disturb the line, you could glide as if the lake had decided to help. Shepherds on high pastures described seeing a faint stripe touch the snow and drift across toward a notch in the ridge, and that following it felt like walking next to music. People argued about where these pale trails ran, some toward Alfheim, others toward gardens on the far side of the moon, and one notorious rumor insisted they led to markets where you could trade old lullabies for new ones. The elves did not confirm or deny any of this. Their silence might be secrecy, or may simply be that they enjoy a good quiet path and don't want it getting crowded. In certain accounts, Odin steps into these matters with all the noiselessness of a person who has learned how to make even a staff stop clicking on stones. Cloaked as the Wanderer, he is said to favor bridges that do not require a permission slip. He would set his foot on a plank that looked like any other, and the wood would stiffen as if remembering its job. He walked the ice ladders with a balance that would have made a cat squint. He took the sewn ribbons downward too, because knowledge has a way of collecting where visibility is low. There are carvings, faint as breath on glass, at the posts of certain forgotten spans. They read like notes someone leaves for themselves on the fridge, a short charm, a direction, a very specific warning of a very specific rock. The handwriting is awkward in places, which makes the whole thing friendlier. It is customary to imagine Odin traveling for grand reasons, but the records suggest a lot of errands. He walked to see how the frost was setting in Jotunheim, to check on a cave in Nibelheim that made a sound like a thinking kettle, to measure whether a pillar of sky was leaning because of wind or because of intention. The rumor that he kept a little notebook of bridge temperaments is surely exaggerated. Still, it is said he knew which spans liked early morning and which grew sullen after rain. Some paths required an offering, placed not in a dish but on a memory, a feather for a whisper bridge, a coin for a span that remembered rivers, an old line of verse for one that valued conversation. It's all very human for the All-Father, which is perhaps the point. When you have an eye for the horizon, the small crossings matter most because they let you arrive before an event becomes a capital letter. Prophecy complicated matters. Certain bridges, so the seers insist, appeared only during eclipses or on the clean edge of winter, when the sun seems to stand very still and consider its options. These paths belong to no realm and every realm at once, like those side doors in old houses that strangely emerge inside wardrobes. Odin looked for such crossings when he chased rumors of Ragnarok. He followed lines that wavered in the cold, like threads pulled through a loom too quickly. Some ways demanded sacrifices before they would fully show. The Norns do not charge in coin. Their price is attention. Stand on one of these eclipse bridges and listen as tightly as you can, and you might hear a sentence from your future that sounds exactly like the wind in bare branches. He took those words home and set them where he could see them, the way a person pins a note to the wall by the door. Remember milk, except the milk in this case was remember what breaks. As the end times edged closer, the bridges developed personalities more than problems. Wood swelled at odd hours. Ice grew glassy and then sighed into water. Stones decided to be pebbles for a while. A path might hold until the second traveler set foot on it, as if rewarding initiative. Another would support a cart full of hay, but not a single feather more, which must have seemed like a joke to the cart driver and to the feather. Poets say that one after another, the delicate crossings cracked and went quiet. And there is a rhythm in those lines that makes you think of a drum wrapped in cloth, tapped with 2 fingers. Places that had once felt within reach retreated as if embarrassed. The gods tried not to notice. Noticing makes things more true. Messengers circled the tree using familiar routes and returned with the news that familiar routes had been replaced by arrangements which strongly resembled puzzles. When the paths vanished, people did not always realize it, the same way you don't assume they misplaced a word until you need to use it. Hunters felt they should already be at the bend in the river because that is where they always stood by this time of day and then found themselves still halfway, as if the land had added a polite extra minute for no reason. Children chasing willow wisps ran across meadows that folded and unfolded like tablecloths being shaken out very gently. The lake light vanished when a cloud looked at it. The ice ladder slid quietly into the gorge and became the gorge, which is both practical and a little rude. If a person complained, the wind pretended to be extremely interested in a pinnacone. This was when the legends of the ones who never returned grew in quantity and in carefulness. Every hall had a story of a friend or cousin who went to check a bridge they knew better than their own porch step. They all say almost the same thing. The person stepped into the middle distance, waved once in a perfectly ordinary way, and then the middle distance took a deep breath and forgot to let it out. Most of these tales are not sad so much as curious. A few claim that those travelers reached rooms where the fire never drops below the comfort setting, where sleep arrives on time and speaks softly. Others insist that the missing ones became caretakers, the spirits that oil hinges and straighten planks, walking their routes like librarians doing a shelf read. I favor this idea because I like a universe where the lost turn into guides, and also because it gives a very pleasant shape to walking home in the dark. You keep company without needing to say a word. On evenings when frost draws slow ferns across windows, The elven pathways sometimes show themselves for a heartbeat, as if a match had been struck far away. You can tell the difference between imagination and invitation because invitation leaves a small trace of cool on the side of your nose, like the air near a sea cave. My favorite map of Yggdrasil is not a picture but a way of standing, weight evenly balanced, knees not locked, chin tipped to listen, the posture of someone prepared to meet a bridge halfway. The old sagas talk all the time about bravery, which is fair, but bravery is not always noisy. Often it is the calm choice to step onto the next stone, and then the next, measuring your breath, letting your feet do arithmetic. There is a small tradition, half superstition and half good manners, of leaving something on your side of a vanished bridge in case it returns. People choose informal offerings, a sprig of dried heather, a piece of chalk, crumbs too delicious for birds to resist, a line from a song that has done its work and can be retired with honors. If the bridge does come back, maybe it likes gifts. If it doesn't, you will have decorated a root of Yggdrasil, which is a very respectable way to pass a morning. Even the gods respect this habit. Thor is said to have once left a bundle of nails on a stump to thank a mossy footbridge that held under the weight of his patience. The nails were not for repair. They were to make the bridge feel handy if it ever wanted to build itself a railing. The rainbow of Bifrost, too, had its quieter days, when the colors washed out like watercolor left in the sun. People wrote poems claiming you could tell the weather from how pale the yellow was, though I am not sure anyone actually could. When the sky was right, Bifrost was a respectable highway like any other. When the sky was wrong, the world used its side streets. I suspect the small bridges appreciated this arrangement, the way a back road enjoys the peace that arrives after the festival ends. The hidden crossings carried mostly ordinary cargo, messages wrapped in wax cloth, hot gossip, bread still warm in its cloth. The sort of things that keep a community behaving like a community. Every now and then a god would step across with a secret in their pocket. The bridges never told, which seems a good qualification for a long career. One of the kinder rumors says that when everything finally fell, when the end tore through names and ropes and courage, the bridges were the last to go. They held like friendly hands, letting each traveler place their weight calmly. They folded only when no one was on them. This rumor might simply be hospitality projecting itself onto architecture, but it is pleasant to keep near. Another says that in the New World, after all the cinders wash away and the grass invents itself again, the first things that appear are the small crossings. One connects a low bank to a slightly lower bank where there is more clover. Another crosses a ditch dug by an absent-minded stream. Expedition becomes amble. Destiny becomes a well-marked footpath with rest spots every few steps. It seems practical for a re-beginning. And today, if you walk the edge of a wood where roots heave the earth into gentle lumps, you may feel something under your boot that was not there a moment ago, a firmness like a yes. It does not have to lead anywhere heroic. Maybe it goes to a blackberry thicket you have already met. Maybe it goes to a shop where the bread is still warm and the baker says you should have the end slice for free because someone has to be brave. Bridges seldom mind repetition. They enjoy watching familiar faces on a loop. Ravens will ride the air above you, muttering their endless commentary. A troll may pretend to be a boulder and then congratulate itself on the performance after you pass. The world continues to balance on what is sturdy and what is kind. I like to think the Norns keep a drawer of extra paths, the way tidy people keep spare keys. When someone needs to cross a stretch of loneliness or a puddle of worry, a bridge clicks into place for exactly as long as it is needed. No one writes a poem about it because the walk is short and the view is mostly moss, but by the time you reach the other side, you have remembered the sentence you were trying to say earlier and can finish it comfortably. This may not be canonical myth, but is good maintenance. The universe holds together in part because someone keeps tucking small comforts where they are likely to be found. If your eyes are heavy now, imagine the bridges as sleepy as you are. They yawn and straighten their planks. They let the frost borrow their edges for art. They stack themselves tidily, the way playing cards sit together when you press them soft with your palm. Somewhere under Yggdrasil, a root sighs, and a light bridge winks, and a stone path lines up its pebbles so they will be easy to count tomorrow. Someone, either a god or a very determined bird, leaves a note on a post, back soon. It is the most ordinary promise in all the worlds, which is why it is comforting. And the night breeze and the bridges listen, and the story could go on forever, listing spans and steps, and the names of small rivers your tongue already knows until the sound of it gently lands you where you are going. You might not expect a ship to carry its own pocket, and yet Skyblafner does, and it is the tidiest pocket you could imagine. The old stories say the dwarfs designed it that way, not as a flourish, but as a courtesy to the owner, because leaving a full-size vessel leaning against a wall is the sort of thing neighbors talk about. Skyblafner belongs to Freyr, the peaceful one with fields in his mind and good weather folded in his voice. The ship is always ready, always cheerful, and always, very slightly, smelling of pine tar and cold iron like a carpenter's apron that remembers the sea. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you could subscribe for more politely unhurried boat talk, or you could close your eyes and let the breeze from this sentence do the paperwork for you. The ship will understand either way. They say the dwarfs who began this boat were the sons of Ivaldi, the very same who once made new hair for Sif, which is an odd credential for naval work until you remember that both hair and rigging are mostly a matter of strands behaving themselves. In the cool caverns under the mountains, a bench was cleared and measured not in inches or cubits, but in beard widths, which is more traditional and, depending on the beard, more forgiving. The planks were not sawn from trees. They were persuaded, the way one persuades a sleepy friend to stand up gently and with the promise of breakfast. The nails held without complaint. Runes were scratched along the keel like notes on a shopping list. Fair wind, no splinters, please float, thank you. Somewhere a small hammer rang at a steady rate that would have made an excellent lullaby if dwarf hammers believed in lullabies. The remarkable part was always the folding. Every hinge was hidden. Every seam agreed to unmake itself, and then remember itself again, like a good sentence that can be read backward and still knows where it lives. The gift was presented to Freyr with the sort of simple pride that follows complicated labor. He set the ship in a meadow first, because that is what you do with new things in the north. You show them grass so they want to be homesick later. It shone the way fresh bread shines. Freyr boarded, and as soon as he touched the mast, the breeze arrived like a punctual guest. It is Skyblowner's nature to arrange the air. No one shouts at the wind on this vessel. It comes pre-agreed. Raise the sail, and it lifts without creases. Lower it, and the cloth lies so flat that you could write a tidy letter on it and not lose a word to wrinkles. There is room for every god and a few carefully invited mortals. And if more arrive, the deck decides to be slightly larger, the way a hospitable table seems to widen when more marble appears. A gull once circled the ship 3 times, and then sat on the stern as if to supervise. It was that kind of calm. Sailing Skyblafner never involves the anxiety so many people associate with boats. There's no searching for the wind because the wind has already found you. There is no argument with currents because the currents have very reasonably decided to go where you are going. The ship slides as if the sea is pleased to have something neat moving about on it, the way a clean desk is pleased by a well-sharpened pencil. The oars, when Freyr bothers with oars at all, dip like polite nods and lift again with a small, respectful drip. The mast's shadow keeps even time on the water. You can eat on this ship without your bread gathering salt that wasn't invited. The ropes are braided tight enough to satisfy a careful person, but loose enough to humor a forgetful one. Everything is arranged for the nap that might occur while you are supposedly keeping an eye on the horizon. There is a charming rumor that the ship keeps a mental list of passengers who prefer the bow and passengers who prefer the shoutless end of the stern. It positions them accordingly when no one is looking, so that conversation falls into a comfortable pattern and pauses happen at the right length. Skyblafnir is good with pauses. It believes in them the way farmers believe in rain at the proper hour. It also seems to enjoy carrying things for people who didn't realize they needed carrying. That is how baskets full of apples and little sacks of barley keep appearing near the mast. The apples shine without bragging. The barley makes a gentle sound when the hull flexes, a sound like indecisive rain. If you lean on the rail, and everyone does sooner or later, you may smell resin and remember a forest you passed through once in late afternoon, the light falling in slow square pieces. This is exactly the mood the ship prefers. The folding happens after a journey the way yawning happens after a warm room. Freyr strokes the gunwale, or sometimes he simply thinks the thought that begins, "It would be convenient if," and the ship obliges. The sail tucks itself inward, all the wind going out of it in one well-behaved exhale. Planks soften along their clever seams and slide together with the quiet of 2 pages closing. The keel relaxes into a neat line you could measure with a ruler if rulers had any business in myth. In a moment, Skyblafnir becomes something a person can carry under one arm, the way they might carry a well-fed cat or an optimistic loaf. The ship never resents this. It has opinions, yes, but not that kind of pride. Being portable is part of its joy. It understands the relief of a tidy pocket. People sometimes ask where Freyr keeps the folded ship. The best answer is that he keeps it where a gardener would keep his favorite knife, near the hand he uses most. Sometimes on a hook by the door, sometimes in a pouch that's really just a piece of cloak folded into a different cloak. The pouch smells pleasantly like sailcloth and hillside. There are stories of Freyr setting Skyblafnir on a windowsill while tying his boots, or lending it to Njarda with a note that says only for the weekend. It is a friendly object, prone to being where it is useful. Imagine checking your pockets before leaving the hall in the morning. Comb, handkerchief, folded ship. That quiet click of readiness is almost a sound the vessel makes, as if to say, yes, we have our plans, and our plans are to drift someplace nice and be home for bread. The dwarves who made the ship also gave it a way of measuring time that never feels strict. On Skyblafnir, an hour is the distance between 2 unhurried stories. A day is the number of times someone remembers an old song and gets all the words right by accident. Night is when the sail makes a pale triangle against the sky, and even the gull on the stern looks pleased with the arrangements. There is a small bell near the mast, not for danger, not for orders, just a single note you can ring when you pour someone else a drink. A different ring says dinner has politely decided it is ready. The kettles behave on this ship because there is very little else to do. Even soup understands the value of a slow plan. When people speak of magical vessels, they usually picture fleets and thunder and announcements. Skyblafnir is not like that. Its magic is the sort that makes room, literally and otherwise. It lets a crowded day find a clear lane. It organizes your thoughts into lines as clean as wake on still water. It is impossible to hurry on this ship because the ship has already scheduled your arrival for the moment that causes the least inconvenience to everyone involved. Even storms soften nearby. Clouds approach with the energy of someone about to say, "I thought I had a question," and then forget what it was. Lightning chooses to practice somewhere else. The rain that falls is the friendly kind that rinses cups. The crew is a loose idea here. There are always enough hands, and sometimes they are your own. If Odin rides along, he turns the lines with gratifying neatness. One cannot collect that many memes for wisdom without also knowing a square knot. If Frigg visits, she sets cups on the thwart precisely where no one will knock them over. Thor once tried to coil a rope vigorously, and the rope coiled itself with a small, benevolent sigh to spare everyone the performance. Loki, on good days, consults the breeze like a waiter recommending a wine, and then appears to take credit for it. The ship doesn't mind. It knows what it is, a self-contained answer to the question, wouldn't it be nice if travel were mostly a nap? Because it belongs to Freyr, the ship is excellent with fields and shores. It can slide gently up onto a beach without scuffing so much as a shell. It can tuck itself between reeds in a river the width of a respectable path. A farmer once swore he saw it resting in a stubble field after harvest, looking as content as a wagon with its work done. There are even accounts of the vessel visiting lakes half covered with ice, easing itself into a channel like a spoon into porridge, unbothered. Helpful, leaving behind edges so clean, the first skaters of winter whispered thanks without meaning to. Everywhere it goes, it behaves as if the place had been expecting it in a perfectly ordinary way. The most interesting detail to boat keepers is the absence of chores. On ordinary ships, there are barnacles to persuade, ropes to gossip with, patches to encourage, teeth of salt to brush off hulls. Skyblafner courteously declines most of this. Barnacles, upon approaching, become thoughtful and attach themselves to rocks instead, having suddenly remembered a prior engagement. The deck dries itself to the comfortable end of dry. The sail never mildews because mildew does not want to embarrass itself here. The only maintenance is ceremonial. Freyr runs his hand along the rail to say hello. A little pine tar is dabbed on places that are already content, and a story is told to the mast so the mast will not be bored. This is a vessel that exists so pleasantly that even entropy hesitates. When the ship is folded and put away, it does not sulk. It enjoys being an object among objects. There are other gifts in the hall rings that do arithmetic, hammers with opinions, spears that make promises, and Skyblafner sits among them like a tidy thought. Sometimes a child lifts it because it is the size of something a child is allowed to lift, and the ship obliges by feeling pleasantly heavy without being a burden. The child will tap it, and the pocketed hull replies with a small wooden note. That is exactly the sound of a door left open in a friendly house. Adults do this too when no one is looking. It is very difficult not to tap a ship that fits in your palm. Of course, there are maps. Freyr keeps them because maps are a kind of hospitality, the promise that you want to be abandoned to guesswork. He likes shorelines that look like they have been tidily brushed. He draws little barley stalks where the beer is good, and he marks benches with a sign only he understands, which basically means excellent for watching clouds, lose arguments with mountains. Skyblafner does not need these maps to navigate, but it seems to enjoy their company. The ship's shadow, when spread across a chart, looks like a second coast invented on the spot. If you put your finger on a point and say, "There," the ship will nod in whatever way ships nod and make room for the weather between here and there. When people ask what sound Skyblafner makes in motion, the answer is the quiet of competent fabric. The sail whispers to itself like a librarian reading a favorite line. The hull murmurs to the water as though complimenting it on being so very well arranged. Footsteps on the deck are less footsteps and more polite suggestions sent to the wood. Now and then a rope creaks in that reassuring way that says, "I'm awake." If you nap in the bow, and you will, the dream you have is always a practical one. You are filling a basket with smooth stones that never run out, or you are folding a blanket that somehow fits its chest perfectly on the first try. These are ship dreams. If a mortal borrows Skyblafner, as sometimes happens when a story needs an errand to proceed, the ship adjusts to mortal expectations the way a good chair adjusts to a new reader. The breeze is tuned to confidence +1. The route avoids reefs that would require learning new vocabulary. The shore rises where you hoped it would. When you step off, your legs do not have to negotiate with land for long. And when you turn back, the boat has already folded itself and is waiting in your pocket, the way a pen waits for a signature on a decision already made. Plenty of myths test their heroes. This one offers them a ride. There is a cousin tale that says Skyblafner can be unfolded on land and used as a hull when the weather is contrary. The mast becomes a column, the sail becomes a roof, and the hull becomes benches that warm to the person sitting on them. Soup tastes better under this roof, even if you were already pleased with the soup. Stories told inside the ship's hull acquire an extra teaspoon of luck. Sometimes the vessel will let a stray dog nap beneath it. If it rains at night, the drips organize themselves into a steady rhythm useful for counting sheep or apples or good decisions. In the morning, the ship shakes itself politely and becomes a ship again with all the discretion of someone folding a blanket before anyone else is awake. Because we are talking about a Norse boat, people expect storms. Skyblafner knows storms the way librarians know loud voices. It meets them with calm procedure. The sail flattens, the mast lowers a trifle, the ropes tuck in. The bow selects a line that keeps time with the deeper water. Thunder notices that the conversation here has already been handled and wanders, off to find a mountain with fewer policies. Lightning writes its name somewhere else. Rain insists on being a mist, which is easy to enjoy from under a hood. Afterward, the ship is not triumphant. It simply resumes being itself, like a kettle returning to the business of tea. Some evenings you may see, along a fjord or across a lake that is minding its own mirror, a triangle of pale cloth that hardly seems to touch the wind at all. People sometimes raise a hand even if no one is on board, because raising a hand to a well-made thing is a natural reflex. Skyblafner will slide by, leave the water as tidy as it found it, and turn a corner that didn't feel like a corner until just then. If you were to call out a question, "Where are you going?" the answer would be something like, "Over there," where the day is putting itself away in a well-labeled drawer. There is no final voyage for this ship in the sagas that keep gentle company. If Ragnarok needs it, the vessel will likely carry who and what it can to wherever new fields will grow, because Freyr is the sort to think ahead about planting. Folding will be useful then too, but for now it is enough to imagine the boat resting on a palm or unfolding on a pebble beach where the waves have already ironed the stones, or skimming along a river that has decided to be particularly reasonable. The gods step aboard without ceremony. The day puts its hand on the mast. The ship draws a smooth line across the water and then, because it can, folds into a sentence small enough to tuck behind the ear of anyone who needs to remember that not all magic is loud. If your eyes are heavy, picture the deck sanded just so, the rope ends whipped and neat, the sails settling toward its quiet triangle. The breeze will keep the lightest edge of cool so your pulse can recognize it. The hull will tell the water a brief, polite story about getting from here to there with no surprises. A gull will agree. Freyr will touch the rail once, almost the way you touch the door frame when you pass it and wish the room a good day. And then the ship will become its pocket self the way a thought becomes a breath, and the tide will turn pages without expecting you to read, and the whole scene will continue soft as folded cloth for as long as you need it to. Some bridges do their best work by not looking like bridges at all, and the oldest stories say Yggdrasil has more of those than leaves. At the base of the tree, where roots twist like sleeping snakes, and the soil smells calmly of wet bark and a little honey, there are paths that forget themselves on purpose. A wooden rail may be just a cinnamon dark ribbon of grain in the dirt, yet if you walk beside it while thinking of a place you have not yet visited, your steps begin counting in a new language. Pebbles hold their breath. The roots curve out, in and out again, and suddenly the ground ahead looks like the ordinary ground behind it, except you feel as if some gentle clerk has stamped your passport while you weren't watching. If you're still awake a bit later, you can subscribe to these quiet crossings, Or you can simply close your eyes and let the tree do the paperwork. I never tell on anyone. The cartographers of the gods tried to map these routes. They sharpened charcoal, they drew arrows, they made notes like, turn left where the route looks like a sleeping seal, which is helpful until you realize many routes look like sleeping seals from certain angles. There were signs briefly. One said, maximum load, 3 goats, which was followed by an illustration of a very responsible goat advising 2 more responsible goats to wait. The ravens tested the paths, of course. They know that bridges should be checked for crumbs. They hopped along, approving and disapproving in precise clicks, and learned which plankways would take a light mine to Alfheim and which stone lips descended to hell. Some were not even walkways, but the kind of light that behaves like a polite floor. You stand on a spill of morning that has no source, and it gently escorts you somewhere your feet have never voted to go. Everyone knows Bifrost, that famous rainbow arch that behaves as if the sky decided to become helpful. It is bright, yes, and dutiful, and it carries heroes like a well-run ferry. But the lesser bridges worked the quieter shifts. There was the frost slat that linked one frozen ridge to another above Jotunheim, a ribbon of ice that rang when reindeer hooves touched it, as if the cold were humming to itself. There was the plank path laid by messengers between Vanaheim's reed beds and Midgard's trading shore. Narrow, paintless, rearranged every spring by thoughtful hands who never left a signature. There was the shy raft of light that waited between the trunks of the world tree, yellow as butter, for the person who had been searching all day and only then remembered what they were searching for. Bifrost shone for everyone. These others shone for the exact person who needed them, the way a memory brightens when you put your key down in precisely the right bowl by the door. At night the roots hold dew like silver coins. If a traveler sleeps beneath them, the coins buy a very specific dream in which the traveler walks a bridge they have never seen and arrives at a kitchen they somehow remember, a little smoke, a wooden spoon standing at attention in a pot, and the sense that someone trustworthy has just stepped outside to feed the chickens. When the traveler wakes, the dream stays under the tongue like a hard candy that doesn't quite dissolve. The day's path feels easier to choose. The bridges beneath the tree seem to approve, as if every root enjoys the small praise of being stepped on kindly. A squirrel runs along the railings, performing inspections with its tail. Somewhere a beetle tidies the moss into a neat green collar around a post. A different set of crossings belong to the giants and the trolls, whose spatial etiquette is not ours but does have rules. Troll bridges appear in fog the way pens appear under a pile of papers only after you stop looking for them. They were built of bone and quarried night, sturdy in a thoughtful way, the sort of strength that never argues with gravity, only negotiates fair terms. You would see nothing but river mist and the curve of 2 hills leaning toward each other, and then a pale bar would materialize out of the softness, like a sentence that realizes halfway through it wants to be helpful. Take 3 steps, and the 4th step would feel like stepping onto someone's long sigh. Trolls prefer moonlight for construction because it shows where the mud tries to be clever. Their bridges also like tolls, not because trolls need the money, but because coins make a tidy sound in a wooden bowl. Sometimes they accept recipes instead. A carefully written method for cabbage soup will get you across a formidable span more quickly than gold, though the ink must be dry. By contrast, the elves make pathways that look like consensus between stars. A faint glitter appears on the surface of a lake, arranged not as randomness, but as a very old invitation, lace stretched so thin it could be breath. Step out and the water refuses to wet you. It prefers politeness. The path leads, oh so gently, toward the dark edges of forests where everything smells like fern fiddleheads and last year's rain. By day, the same lake is only a lake, content in its own reflections, and the pathway becomes whichever ripple happens to be in the mood to be a ripple. Sailors trade stories about nights when their skiffs slid forward without oars, the boat humming to a tune that sounded suspiciously like someone counting constellations. Elven bridges disapprove of hurrying. They reward the step that believes in itself and punish nothing at all. There is simply no second step if the first was suspicious. Some of these elven paths like to attach themselves to dew. Walk through a meadow at dawn, and you might find your ankles learning a new grammar of wet brightness that somehow stays neatly on the grass blades and not on you. The path rises, barely, and the field lowers, barely, and for a minute the world agrees to hold you right between. If you've been carrying more thoughts than a person needs for one morning, the glow takes a few away, like a well-meaning ant removing extra chairs from a table. Birds mind the borders. Warblers, in particular, are good with rules. If you turn to look back, the meadow pretends it has no idea what you're talking about. There are bridges built by stories themselves. Tell a tale in a certain voice, and the air thickens in front of your words, forming a small plank of attention that other people can walk along for a while. This is why some giants kept old men around to rehearse sagas across ravines, while the younger giants carried timber. The voice would lay the first span. The timber would complete it. On quiet nights, a listener might notice how a narrative tightens its ropes and checks its pegs. Every good crossing enjoys a narrative inspection. There is a particular pause just before an important name that feels exactly like the test step a builder takes before allowing a crowd across. The pause says, yes, this will hold us all. Even trolls appreciate that pause. As for Odin, he has a habit of walking bridges that do not yet exist, and then stepping back onto the shore and allowing them to have existed all along. Cloak tight, hat down, he moves the way a pencil moves when it has already seen the finished sketch. The wanderer favors narrow crossings, a beam not much wider than a boot sole stretching from a cliff lip in Midgard to a shadowed ledge in Niflheim, or a rope that pretends to be moss between two branches grown very far apart. He marks his path with runes only sometimes. Often he leaves a physical clue that looks like a practical note, an extra knot in a rope, a stone turned, so its flat side faces sunrise, a peel of birch bark tucked under a root with the smooth side up. Scholars try to collect these things, then become sleepy while writing their papers and dream of bridges that insist on being revised. There is an old remark that Odin measures distance in dream lengths. One dream length equals the time required for a heavy thought to sigh and set its head down. By that measure, he makes good time. He crosses from one realm to another while a kettle boils or a story finds its middle, and he rarely ruffles a feather on the ravens' necks. The bridges he chooses do not like witnesses. They prefer to remember themselves only after he has passed. It is said that if you stand at the edge of a marsh at twilight, and if you are not trying to be clever, you may see a faint seam where the reeds disagree with the air. That seam is a bridge's afterthought. If you are very quiet, it will tell you the weather 2 days from now. Prophecy uses bridges with different manners. Some appear only during eclipses, when the world is politely adjusting the light for a moment. The path is the edge between shadow and not shadow, and it moves slowly like a considerate waiter carrying many bowls. Step along it, and you will hear not one future, but several, gently overlapping like the way a brook says 3 different things to 3 different stones. Odin hears all of them and answers none. Another prophetic crossing can be found on the night of the winter solstice where the first footprint does not sink. A single board of starlight lays itself over the snow, so modest it could be mistaken for reflection. Walk it, and the Norns will whisper only about the small futures lost mittens found, a lamb born healthy, a kettle catching before it boils over. Big prophecies are unkind to sleep. The Allfather saves them for megaphones, not bridges. Poets have argued that bridges hum in the key of patience. This becomes very noticeable as the world tilts toward the last chapters. When the rumors of Ragnarok were still long benches away, the lesser crossings began to change their minds. A plank would sigh, step down into a stream, and say it had become a fish. A rope would confess it had always wanted to be a vine, and proceed to practice being a vine, even where this made crossing unlikely. Travelers adjusted by leaning on each other and discovering that, surprisingly, leaning makes a decent bridge. There were reports of whole villages learning to cross river shallows arm in arm, laughing softly as if synchronized balance were a minor festival. In the hills, a stone arch politely returned to being two stones and a gap, as if to remind everyone that not all convenience is permanent. The gap was handsome in its way. Signs changed too. 3 goats maximum turned to 1 goat at a time, please, and eventually goats decide among themselves. The goats did, holding a meeting under a birch with commendable minutes and a ban on headbutting near the edge. Some paths shrank like sweaters after hot washing, becoming just big enough for a person carrying only the necessary thoughts. Other paths stretched thin, transparent as a soap bubble, and required a calm stir to cross. People who learned to look through their worries did best. Bridge keepers, those wanderers whose job had been checking planks, oiling hinges, and writing kind notes to trolls, took to walking at dawn, leaving strings of bells in fog so that the disappearances would have good manners. The bells sounded like careful teaspoons. Stories multiplied about travelers who followed a hidden channel of light through a marsh and never returned. The softest versions say they reached halls where feasts never ended and nap benches were always just the right length. Another version claims that some became part of the bridges themselves, not transformed into beams or stones, but into the idea that a crossing is possible. Stand by a river at dusk and feel a confidence you didn't earn. That could be one of those travelers thinking generous thoughts in your direction. The thought says, "You have made many good steps already. This next one will be another. There are worse fates than to become encouragement." The tree noticed. Yggdrasil is rumored to keep a ledger of what it supports. Nests, conversations, misplaced hats, marriages that require a certain amount of shade. In the margin, it added tiny marks for bridges gone on leave. Sap rose like a slow round of applause. At the foot of the trunk, small paths remained for errands still worth running. Carrying a blanket to a neighbor, meeting a friend at the river for the practical business of skipping stones, bringing home bread. An old woman whose knees had their own weather report found a new plank one morning where yesterday had been only ditch. She crossed with her basket and said, without surprise, "Well, that's considerate." The plank, being made of considerate, bowed very slightly and then turned back into the color of surrounding weeds. The more famous arch the Rainbow Road everyone expects to talk about loudly kept its post like a well-trained lighthouse. If the sky needed to carry warriors or fetch messages, it did so with adequate ceremony and without drama. But even Bifrost seems at times to look down and admire the little bridges, the ones that proceed with no trumpet and no scolding. The rainbow hears their quieter music and lowers its voice a notch. One evening, after rain had been carefully hung to dry on the edges of clouds, a child pointed up and said, "That's the big one you can see. And down here are the small ones you can feel. This is how the accounting tends to go at the end of a long day." By the time prophecies have become weather rather than rumor, the crossings do something kind on their way out. They leave behind ripples of habit. People step to the left at the old bridge site because that is where the second plank used to sit, and stepping there feels like good luck. Travelers pause before an empty gap as if waiting for an old friend to arrive, then smile at the memory and find the ford a little downriver. Someone ties a ribbon to a branch without meaning to, and everyone who passes feels steadier. These are almost bridges, still working, softer now, but insistent in their suggestion that a way over exists, even when the wood has decided it would like to be a tree again. If you listen, you can hear the biographies of bridges and the voices of those who maintained them. A keeper at a mountain pass will tell you about a beam that squeaked in a friendly dialect only on Tuesdays. A ferryman turned bridge walker will admit that water prefers full sentences but can be charmed by nouns. An old carpenter swears he once made a plank from a board that had been a door, that had been a table, that had been part of a ship, and that the plank remembered each role on rainy days and offered shelter, meal, and passage to anyone who needed them in that order. It is comforting to think wood has that kind of resume. And so the world, even with endings rehearsing themselves in the wings, stays walkable in small ways. A fog curls over a ravine and becomes a brief causeway long enough for a shepherd to fetch a lamb with ideas of adventure. Stars lean toward each other and practice geometry for the benefit of a sleepless fisherman finding his path back across the water. A root rises just high enough to be a step. A story tightens its ropes and extends one more span of voice across the gap where someone is listening. Nothing announces itself as salvation. Everything behaves as helpful furniture does, positioned exactly where a foot expects to land. Sturdy, quiet, unconcerned with applause. If you are drifting now, let the last few bridges be made of small things. Imagine the smell of damp bark where the tree keeps its pocket paths. Picture a coin of dew learning to be a star for half a minute, and then relaxing into water again. See a narrow board over a ditch lifting itself slightly as an old woman passes, because memory can be courteous. In a far meadow, an elven path draws a thin line across grass that refuses to bend, and the line says, in the softest way, "Here you are." And a little later it says, "There you go." Somewhere a troll counts recipes, satisfied that cabbage soup supports commerce as well as any minted coin. Somewhere the Allfather steps from air to air, hearing futures, leaving behind only the suggestion that walking lightly is a skill with many bridges. And if the crossings grow fewer as the stories tidy their last pages, there will still be a root that rises a rock that knows how to be a step and a pause in the telling that holds you until you make it to the other side with time enough to yawn and not hurry at all. It is a very small secret that the oldest bridges do not begin with wood or stone, but with a feeling that the ground is about to be helpful. At the base of Yggdrasil, where the roots curl like sleeping otters and the soil smells of rain that remembers its first cloud, people sometimes notice that their steps grow tidy all by themselves. A line of ants adjusts direction as if saluting. Moss rises half a thumb's width, the universal height of polite intention. Nothing announces itself, and yet the world puts down a shallow saucer for your foot. That is a bridge in the earliest sense, and if you listen very closely, you can hear the tree making a soft pencil note about your arrival, as though it were keeping minutes for a meeting that never rushes. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you may subscribe to the habit of these gentle crossings, try them again tomorrow or not. Either way, the ground will keep being encouraging. It's really very good at that. The map makers of Asgard did their best to put the unputtable on parchment. They chewed the ends of their quills. They dabbed ink. They argued about whether an arrow should be confident or friendly. One careful scribe invented a symbol that looked like a smiling fern to mark the places where the roots could be persuaded to act as handrails. Another sketched tiny fish along rivers that occasionally remembered they were also roads. He gave each fish a different expression because some waters took you to Alfheim if you laughed, and others preferred a straight face. The scribes disagreed about Bifrost's width, as wide as courage, one wrote, which is not a measurement the Carpentry Guild recognizes. They finally added an apologetic note. Expect surprises, carry snacks. The ravens approved. They believe provisions are a form of truth. Not all of the tree's bridges behave like bridges. There is a path under the north root that is simply warmer than the air around it, a ribbon of patient temperature that coils away into mist and returns hours later, smelling faintly of cinnamon and clean dust. A hunter can step on that warmth and be escorted across a marsh without consulting the reeds. There is a pale band of lichen on a southern buttress that functions as a ledger. Anyone who walks beside it hears last year, as footsteps repeating in quiet harmony, which is both comforting and useful if you want to borrow a rhythm. You may also encounter a listening plank, which is not a plank at all, only a beam of attention that flattens and stretches between two places while you think of a third. If your thoughts are heavy, the span thickens. If your thoughts are light, it prefers to be ribbon thin. It has excellent manners either way. Those are the friendly crossings that live near the roots and meet you halfway. Farther out, there are bridges that imitate birds and bridges that imitate rules. The bird bridges are shy. They fly just ahead of you until you forget you were following them, then become a fixed thing exactly at the moment you need certainty. The rule bridges can be summoned by anyone who says aloud a sentence with an unusual number of commas. Giants invented that protocol, and the commas are doing important work. Somewhere in Midgard, there is a farm with a low gate where a plank unfolds whenever a visitor raises their hand and admits with sincerity that they may have come on the wrong day. The plank appreciates humility and folds back up immediately afterward, like a good lesson that takes only a minute. Up in the foggy folds, where the hills lean their shoulders together, lives the troll kind of engineering. Trolls prefer components that do not gossip. Bone is excellent for this, and so is night. On chilly evenings, they lay beams across ravines with gestures as slow as weather. Their bridges are unblinking, practical, and faintly scented with the honest minerals of caves. If you cross one and set down a coin, a troll will be pleased, because coins ring like small bells, and the sound carries the satisfaction of a job well done. But a recipe is also accepted. A neat paragraph about stewing turnips will do, though spice measurements must be reasonable. Once a traveler paid with a sketch of a spoon. The bridge accepted it, but added a toll of one sincere compliment to the nearest fungi. Troll bureaucracy is simple but not lax. Troll bridges are famous for appearing in mist with the same timing as a good idea. You don't look, and then there it is, practical as a shelf. And then, because trolls admire fairness, the bridge goes away again so that the ravine may have its turn at being a ravine. Their spans are marked with pebbles pressed in at even intervals. This is the unit of deliberate step, which is not the same as careful step. A careful step is worried. A deliberate step trusts gravity to do its portion of the task. Troll bridges do not rush you. They write encouragement under your solace. Elven paths take the opposite approach. They are made of that special agreement stars make with each other when no one is watching. If an elf wishes to cross a dark lake without wetting a shoe, the constellations will rearrange themselves into a faint straightness across the water, as if the sky were practicing calligraphy and needed a long, steady stroke. Sailors talk of nights when their boats slid forward with the oars shipped, the hull humming with a tune as soft as moth wings. If your heart is very busy, the elven path will wait politely until your heart has put away a few thoughts. The path is narrow, but it is narrow in a generous way, down to the width of contentment. By morning, the path has gone back to being light, and the lake pretends it has no idea what you're talking about. Lakes are superb at discretion. There's also a meadow where dew does arithmetic on behalf of travelers. Under starlight, each bead aligns with the next, and soon a pale line draws itself across the grass, raised just enough to teach ankles how to be sure. Birds respect the calculus and do not drink from that dew until the crossing is finished. The calculation can be interrupted by laughter, not because laughter is unwelcome, but because it changes the numbers into more laughter, and the path starts laughing too, and becomes unusable in the immediately helpful sense. This is why some shepherds develop the habit of smiling with their mouths shut, an art widely admired among sheep. Elven crossings are kind to lightness and slightly strict with clumsy intentions. They appreciate people who carry no more than 3 concerns at once, and who know the names of at least 2 kinds of breeze. If you set down a bundle of worries at the edge of the path, The grasses will hold it for you and add a flower on top, not as decoration, but as a receipt. The flower says, yes, you will find these again after your walk. The world is not in a hurry to redistribute them. As a rule, elves prefer that bridges erase themselves when finished to protect the night from becoming too obvious. Mystery is restorative in appropriate quantities. There are pathways that belong to stories too. You can lay a bridge across a quiet room by speaking in a certain voice, and everyone listening will feel the floor not only under their feet, but generously ahead of them, one sentence at a time. Giants once hired old storytellers to do exactly this across dangerous gullies while the younger folk carried supplies. The sentence would swing out, find the faithful shape of, and then unsettle. Children ran across first because they were nimble with, and then adults followed, carrying baskets and the better hammers. The bridge lasted for the length of a well-told tale plus a cup of something warm. When the last line arrived, something tidy about a door being shut for the night, the bridge gave a very small bow and went back to being breath. Odin, who does not dislike company yet somehow always finds the loneliest staircase, uses bridges the way a careful reader uses margins. He writes notes with his boots. They are not obvious notes, they're practical adjustments. A rope gains a second knot where a wind meets a swirl. A stone is angled a thumb width flatter where an old me might appreciate it. A birch bark strip is tucked under a root with its smooth side up, so that someone who reaches for it will not be scratched, and therefore will continue. He does not sign these edits. He prefers that improvements feel like the place itself has had a good idea. When you can, he thinks, let kindness arrive anonymously. It saves time for everyone. There is a particular stretch he favors, 2 sky pillars between which the air climbs and settles. Climbs and settles like a patient animal breathing. He steps across their side, not through cleverness, but through agreement. The air appreciates not being argued with. Sometimes he chooses the narrowest possible plank a thought can become, and sometimes, out of politeness, he uses the larger one, in case anyone is watching and needs an example they can follow later. He is exacting about the difference between showing off and demonstrating, and his ravens keep a quiet ledger of how often he chooses the latter. It makes for excellent bedtime reading for birds. Prophecy has its own bridges with its own policies. One appears where an eclipse lays a traveling edge across the land. If you put your feet exactly on that line shadow on one side, not shadow on the other, you can walk for as long as the moon is curious. And along the way, the air will murmur future weather in a tone that specifically discourages heroic interpretations. Rain is rain, it says gently, not a metaphor. Another prophetic crossing is stitched from solstice frost. It looks like someone has written very small runes across a field. Actually, the frost has simply remembered the alphabet of cold. If you follow the letters in order, they will lead you past 3 small kindnesses that have not yet happened, and 1 small mistake that will be forgiven. The Norns like this bridge. It reinforces their policy on dignity. There is a winter plank that appears only on the year's longest night, an icicle laid horizontally by good intentions. It is not wise to run on it, but it is safe to pause and listen to snow telling you about silence. Snow is repetitive, but never boring. It repeats itself on purpose the way a good lullaby does. Odin has been known to stop at the middle of this bridge and count backward in old numbers. Not because he needs to, but because numbers enjoy exercise, and it keeps them agreeable for everybody. Meanwhile, the ordinary fame of Bifrost goes quietly about its job. It carries messengers. It carries warriors who say very little on the way up and somewhat more on the way down. It smiles rainbowly at people who need to believe a road can also be a promise. But even the great arch has noticed the smaller spans that knit the days together, the footbridge that rises exactly high enough to keep bread dry, the stepping stone that volunteers when a child is wearing good shoes, The path that is nothing but a pair of footprints remembering each other. When the big bridge gets a minute off duty, it admires these little cousins and lowers its brightness by a polite fraction so as not to wash them out. As stories of Ragnarok began to practice in low voices, some bridges reconsidered their careers. Not dramatically, just sensibly. A plank that had spent 30 winters crossing a ditch decided it would rather be a bench and did excellent. Bench work for 20 summers. A rope that had lived confidently between two pines felt a sudden desire to be a swing and met that desire with professional competence, to the great delight of children not yet briefed on apocalypses. A fairy resolved to become a bakery, which surprised everyone but the fairy who had always suspected flour was its destiny. The river missed the conversations but did not begrudge the pastries. Elsewhere, spans grew transparent, not absent but lightly present, like thoughts you can see through. Travelers learned to carry fewer bags and to stop halfway and admire the clouds, because the clouds were doing admirable, intricate work and deserved some attention. Signs changed over time. Maximum load, 3 goats, became 2 goats and 1 goat advisory. Then goats may self-regulate. The goats convened. They formed a committee. Meetings were restful and included salt. Minutes were brief, attendance excellent. The final policy read, 1 at a time, unless there is trust. Goats have a sensible understanding of infrastructure. Bridge keepers went on their rounds with mugs of tea and a pocket full of reassurance. They brushed frost from rails. They told creaking boards, "You are heard." In fog, they hung tiny bells the way bakers dust flour, light and even, so that people would know where the morning intended a crossing to be. The bells made teaspoon sounds, which improved everyone's walking posture without making them think about it. Old people remembered the subject of balance and nodded. Young people didn't notice they were being taught and nodded anyway. There were, as there always are, stories about travelers who followed a luminous seam through reeds at dusk and never returned the usual way. The kindest tales say those travelers arrived in halls where naps are respected as a discipline and biscuits appear exactly when desirable. Another version says some became part of the urging that bridges do a sort of ambient suggestion that a way across exists. Stand by a dark stream and feel patience arrive like an extra coat. That is someone you will never meet improving your night. It is possible this is what heroic afterlife mostly means. No trumpets, only good suggestions at the right moment. In the last pages of this quiet chapter, the paths refuse to panic. A village still needs to move bread from oven to table. The day obliges with a plank that remembers its statcraft. A grandmother still wants to visit the neighbor with the nice stories. The ditch lays itself down like a friendly dog. A child still needs to practice throwing stones, so they hop 1, 2, 3, and the river provides the exact attitude of surface required for moderate success. These are not grand accommodations. They are what the world does when asked nicely. I like to imagine Yggdrasil keeping a modest ledger. Today, it notes, I have supported 7 birds who think in different fonts, 1 carpenter who remembered how to be kind to splinters, 16 conversations that made dinner easier, and 42 crossings that lasted long enough and no longer. In the margins, it draws tiny sketches of bridges that retired happily, a plank now sunning itself in a meadow, a rope learning to make children squeal, 2 stones proud of the gap they hold without collapsing. The tree is old enough to understand that usefulness comes in many quiet flavors. If you are drifting, let the next few steps arrive as softly as they are offered. Think of a bridge that is only the certain feeling your foot gets before it meets the ground. Consider a troll inspecting a toll bowl with professional gravity, then accepting a folded recipe for barley stew because the handwriting is patient. Picture an elven path combing starlight into a straight line, just wide enough for someone who has decided to carry only what will fit in 2 hands and a pocket. Hear a winter plank singing in frost runes about small futures that will show up on time with their hats on, and go home reasonably early. Imagine Odin adding a knot where a wind gets ideas, not to defeat the wind, but to give it a project. The bridges are there, and when they are not, the habit of them is, the world keeps placing the furniture in the right spots. The last line is not a conclusion. It is only another span of voice laid across a gap you were easily going to cross, whether or not you notice the workmanship, and the air is already holding out its hand for your next very ordinary step. They say that Allfather preferred roads that did not know they were roads, and that is a gentle way of saying he liked to walk where maps yawn and look away. Odin's boots were said to be stitched from 9 kinds of wind, which meant they squeaked politely in different dialects depending on the weather. When he set out, the morning would make a small adjustment, like a host straightening a cushion, and a path would consider becoming simpler. He did not bang a staff or announce an errand. Mostly he adjusted the volume of his thoughts until even grass believed it had come up with the plan first. If you are still awake in a few minutes, feel free to follow along or subscribe to the practice of unhurried noticing. Or close your eyes and let him go on ahead, clearing brambles you were never going to meet. The Wanderer's bridges were human-sized in spirit, even when they stretched between enormous things. Some began as the thin places inside a blink. He would close one eye for a heartbeat, and inside that pause, a crossing would lengthen, quiet as a thread being pulled through cloth. He taught shadows to hold a little weight, the same way you teach a shelf to trust a teacup. If he came to a river where ice argued with current, he complimented the ice on its posture until it stood straighter. Then he praised the water for punctuality, and the water flowed around the compliment because it had places to be. More than once, he set a bridge on the back of a very cooperative breeze, a narrow ramp of temperature and tidiness. Barely there, like an invisible hand outstretched, but he only did this when he had time to thank the air afterward. He was careful with gratitude. Nothing clatters louder than forgotten thanks, even in a forest that minds its own business. The ravens, who take minutes at meetings whether or not anyone asked them to, kept a ledger of Odin's crossings. It was not a list of destinations, but of favors returned. This morning, they might write with their tidy beaks, he let the dew finish a sentence, or he carried the sun for 6 steps while it tied its shoe. They recorded small improvements, a knot added where a rope met a gust. A stone rotated half a thumb's breadth to be kinder to knees that had learned many winters. A plank coaxed to remember that straight is a kind of kindness when the traveler is tired. No one saw him do these things. People saw the results and assumed the world had squared its shoulders while they weren't looking. Odin preferred it that way. He believed the best bridges think of themselves as part of the place. Sometimes his secret bridges were not where they seemed at all. Once he crossed a canyon on the reflection of the sky in a pool that was not there yet. He had spoken with the clouds the evening before, nothing elaborate, merely a discussion about their availability, and they were happy to provide a trial mirror. Once he walked along a seam of birdsong running between 2 groves of pines. The melody had been steady for generations. It only needed a reason to enact its obvious bridgeness. He hummed exactly off-key enough to make the path prefer its own pitch, and the ground, pleased to be out soon, shaped itself to match. Another time he used the grammar of runes, stepping along a sentence that would later be carved on an elm. He placed his heel on a verb about patience and his toes on a noun, meaning a place where tea might someday exist, and the future obliged him in both cases. He was fond of bridges made from agreements that everyone had already, the kind we forget we are keeping. If 2 shepherds waved to each other across a valley at the same hour each day, their routine rose into the air and thickened. He could walk their greeting like a causeway and never touch the scree below. If village children invented a rule about not stepping on the cracks for the length of a song, that rule laid itself like a ribbon over the path, and he paced along it with exaggerated respect. careful to place each boot inside the old chant. It is difficult to argue with rule bridges. They have been vetted by the serious part of play. He carried almost nothing, a pouch with crumbs for birds, because hospitality should survive in small pieces, a shaving of oar wood for stirring conversations, a length of quiet string, and a cup that looked carved from honesty. He kept the string for horizons that had forgotten how to be straight. He would loop it around a distant ridge and make a modest tug, not enough to change the world, only enough to remind it of its own intention. The cup was for whatever a place offered when it wished to introduce itself. Once a fjord poured him half a swallow of cold blue, and he nodded as if tasting a familiar story. Once the dawn gave him a sip of slightly warm light that resembled kindness reheated for breakfast. He took everything with equal seriousness and never made a face, because places watch your expressions the way hosts do, and they remember if you flinch dot, there is a tale that he crossed a storm on the polite part of thunder. People forget thunder has paragraphs, the declamation, the mutter, and the gentle apology at the end. Odin timed his step to the apology. He made 4 strides across that softening grumble, then paused midway to compliment the rain on its dedicated attendance. The rain blushed, which in rain looks like more rain, and the bridge was twice as sturdy after that. It is also said that he once used the distance between 2 goats to cross a brook during their discussion. This may be a metaphor. Goats run an efficient bureaucracy, and their debates have excellent suspension. When he traveled between worlds, he disliked to disturb the sensible routines of border creatures. So if he needed to cross where fish were schooling, he consulted their schedule. They arranged themselves into an arrow, a very neat one, because fish adored geometry and held still while he stepped twice. He thanked them later by adjusting the angle of a small stream so that it met their current with fewer mixed messages. Somewhere under a hill, a mole still tells the story of the day the earth tasted like. Courtesy, Odin never forgot to feed the bridges themselves. When he reached the far side, he left a breath or 2 of warmth on the last board. He tucked a quiet into the railing so the next traveler could borrow it. He put a joke only a plank would get under the first nail, something about being level but not flat, and the plank, to its delight, understood. Bridges that laugh become less creaky. This is not physics as we teach it to children, but it is the physics the night remembers. All of this would be extravagant if it were not so calm. He trod between pillars of sky where the air climbed and settled like a patient animal breathing. He crossed glaciers by stepping exactly where blue thought about being white. He went through cave rooms in Niflheim by trusting the echo that liked him best. Each time, the method looked modest enough to misplace. A breath that became a step, the ravens wrote. A step that became a sentence, they wrote another day. A sentence that agreed to be a bridge because no one hurried it. It is a dependable recipe, and some people find it works for getting through winter afternoons. Thought the second kind of crossing, the kind he used when the future was practicing its. Scales appeared where prophecy hung its laundry. There is a strong line of eclipse that moves across a field like a ruler in a mathematician's pocket. If you put one foot on the shadow side and the other on the not shadow side, you can walk along that moving edge, and the world will tell you what it plans to do about wind. Odin walked it once for the length of a boiled egg and learned precisely the weather for a harvest that would not happen for 3 summers. He wrote the forecast in his head beside the list for flour and salt. Prophecy, he believed, should sit at the same table as groceries. On solstice nights, Frost writes tiny runes about the general policies of cold. People mistake these for decorations. Odin read them as minutes from a meeting the winter had with itself. The script runs, less noise from the lakes. Increased sparkle under moonlight. Defer glory until the thaw. He followed those glittering letters like stepping stones and visited 3 small futures. A candle that someone would light with more tenderness than necessary. a door that would be left open exactly long enough, a pair of mittens that would not be lost. The fourth future on that path was a mistake that would be forgiven. He stopped there and practiced the generosity required. Not all bridges want speed. Some prefer rehearsals. Dream bridges were more private. When a sleeper lay on their side and the pillow made a little valley, Odin could cross along the fabric's fold into the country where intentions put on their shoes. The bridge smelled like laundry and remembered lullabies. He walked lightly so as not to wake the part of the dream that handles dramatic exits. Later, the dreamer would open their eyes with the sudden and reasonable need to put an extra log by the door, or to take the slightly longer path to market, and they would never know why the day agreed with them so readily. The Allfather did not believe in meddling. He believed in aligning the furniture. He also crossed through the weft of story. Prophets sometimes speak in the tense that is not quite future and not quite past. The tense of this is already arriving. That grammar makes a sturdy footway. He would place one step on a has always been, and the next on a will keep being, and the syntax would hold. If he required extra steadiness, he borrowed a conjunction and then so or meanwhile. Meanwhile is the best for bridges. It is as supportive as a neighbor handing you a spade and quietly starting the other row. People assume prophecy is all trumpets, but most of it is housekeeping. Odin's hidden paths carried him where he could check the hinges of inevitability and apply a dot of oil. He was not there to change fate, which is touchy when contradicted. He was there to keep the doors from squealing while fate came and went. Sometimes he found a future rattling around like a spoon in a drawer. He wedged a folded napkin beside it so the rattling would not alarm children. Sometimes he tied two likely outcomes together with a quiet string and wrote a label. Either is fine, because outcomes are calmer when they know they're both acceptable. The Norns appreciated the paperwork. "Thank you for your thoroughness," they said without smiling, which is how Norns express delight. If you followed him to a hill before dawn, you might have seen him pause on a bridge that no one built. It is made of the air's opinion right before the sun has won. He stood there and listened to the minutes queuing up for the day, each wearing a hat appropriate to its tasks. He spoke to the minute that would contain a dropped bowl, and arranged for the bowl to bounce once before breaking. He shook hands with the minute that would be lonely, a gentle grip and a nod, and the minute brought a stray cat along to keep it company. The minute with the cloudburst was already wet, which simplified negotiations. He did not command any of them. He thanked them for their service, and they enjoyed being treated as professionals. Micro bridges abound around prophecy. A whisper on a doorstep becomes a bridge when someone inside decides to answer before peeking. The space between a question and the simplest possible reply expands just enough for 2 feet. Odin liked to lean on that rail and consider whether the question could be kinder and the answer shorter. He left with both improved by 3 words and a pause. Prophetic work is often editorial. He avoided spectacle. When he needed to learn the shape of a war still hiding in the future, he did not stride through heroic smoke. He sat on the low bridge where rumor and arithmetic meet and counted boots. Numbers tell the truth when you are polite. He took off his hat to them, and they took off their hats to him, and everyone felt correctly dressed. Then he walked away the long way round by the path of small interruptions, thistles and a hem, a child's lost mitten because a day packed with little. Attention is less available for violence. There is a quiet trick to hidden paths. They want you to act as if you had always intended to be gentle. Odin was very good at this. When he found a plank that had not been thanked in years for holding everyone up, he thanked it now and also on its behalf retroactively, which planks receive with dignity. If a stone had been stepped on too briskly, he placed a leaf on it as an apology that did not require reply. He once left a bowl beside a spring with nothing inside, labeled for wishes that are still rehearsing by Evening the bowl was full of ordinary water that had learned to hum exactly the note that keeps moths away from lanterns. Travelers who used his secret crossing seldom knew they were borrowing his manners. They only noticed that the Nuttles seemed less eager, or that the path held its breath while they tied a shoe, or that a rope bridge stopped counting their steps in a judgmental way and began counting them in a supportive way instead. The difference is subtle, but not small. A judgmental count says, "Oh," another, and a supportive count says, "One more." We're getting there at an agreeable pace. Ropes have feelings about cadence. The ravens, being diligent, sometimes tried to diagram the technique for the library. First, they wrote, "Consider what the place already wants to do." Under that, they drew a small picture of wind practicing. It scales around a pillar of rock. Second, they wrote, "Make a compliment that is also an assignment." A sketch of a good-humored plank appears here, blushing at the word level. Third, they wrote, "Leave something behind that improves the next step for someone else." Sketch shows warm breath curling like steam from a mug. They ended with, "Fourth, do not take credit. The path likes to sign its own name. The librarian, who is a sensible person disguised as a bird." Shelved the diagram between weather, advanced, and kindness. Applied. Now and then a bridge decided to fail to retire, really, in the way structures do when they have taught their lesson thoroughly. When this happened on a crossing Odin was using, he did not argue. He thanked the bridge for its years and then made very modest arrangements for anyone who might be following. A piece of chalk arrowing toward a shallower ford. A polite paragraph left on a stump explaining how to step on stones without scolding them. A bundle of rushes indicating the right sort of foot angle for wetness. He wrote, "Take your time here," and the words themselves behaved like planks for people who believed reading was walking. People sometimes asked the ravens whether Odin ever lacked a bridge. The birds would preen and say that a lack is a kind of path if you look at it from the side. This is how the wanderer would proceed in those minutes. He would make a small table of what a day is made of breath, balance, a willingness to take turns, and then he would use the table. He would put one foot on patience and the other on gravity's good mood, and the world, being reasonably furnished, would oblige. It is helpful to remember that the opposite of a chasm is not a wall. It is a habit of studying. He had a favorite night span, hardly more than a sentence. It lay between when the kettle clicks off and when you pour. He could cross from one thought to another in that pause and arrive with the answer to questions that had insisted on being complicated. He did not hoard those answers. He slid them into other people's pockets the way you slip a napkin under a wobbly table leg. Life sits better afterward, and often no one notices why. If you are still here, very gently we can walk an Odin path together for a few breaths. Lift everything you are carrying and place down whatever does not fit under the word useful. The bridge that appears when you choose the slower lane on purpose. It is made of apology that no longer needs to be said. Step onto the bit of quiet left by someone else who meant well. It holds. Set your heel on a rule that children invented idly this afternoon, and your toe on a promise you would make, even if no one could remember it was yours. And the ground between them will become definite. Do not hurry. There is room. Meanwhile, the Allfather keeps polishing invisible railings. He loosens a knot at a place where the wind likes to complain, so that the knot can go on discussing without tightening. He turns a nail by a hair's width, so it looks better in the mirror of a puddle that has secret vanity. He leaves a crumb for the ant who witnesses everything. A bridge sighs in its sleep and becomes willing to last the winter. Somewhere a prophecy takes off its armor and comes to the door in a sweater. The day looks a touch taller because someone believed it could be. There are other journeys, still, that we will not finish naming. The elbow span between two friends who stop arguing in order to laugh at the same crow. The tiny bridge between a worry and the T that makes the worry imperceptibly smaller. The big arch you cannot see without stepping back, which is the habit of patience stretching from last year to this one. Odin, passing along each of these, does nothing mysterious. He is more than anything a caretaker of ordinary crossings. When a board groans, he answers, "I hear you." When a rope frays, he says, "We will arrange a rest." When a stone wishes to be warmer, he lets sunlight find it and does not take credit for the sun. The technique is easy enough to learn in the way sleep is easy when you stop trying to perform it. So we go on at the slowest possible good speed. In the tilt before dawn, a bridge of uncommitted light proposes itself and is accepted by whoever needs it. In the hush after a kettle, a sentence waits long enough to be kind. In the leftover space from a prophecy, spare steps appear for anyone who prefers this side to that and would like a calm way across. Far off, 2 ravens add a line to the ledger, a path remembered its manners, and then they tuck their heads into their shoulders because the air is doing such a nice job of being breathable. The wanderer moves off without commentary, leaving the smallest surplus of ease in his wake, and there is still time to follow or to sleep, and in either case the next plank is already smoothing itself for the ordinary weight of your foot. It is said there are roads that only appear when the future is thinking quietly to itself, and those are the roads the Allfather preferred when he went in search of prophecy. They do not begin with a milestone or end with a banner. They show up in the soft place between a thought and its next breath, like a shy animal deciding the path is safe. Odin never hurried them. He would stand with his cloak, catching the kind of wind that takes notes, and he would let the road decide it wished to be helpful. If you are still awake in a few minutes, you can come along, or you can let your eyelids choose the shorter journey down. If you doze off, the road will go on, very polite, pretending not to notice it has fewer footsteps to carry. He preferred bridges for this kind of work, not the bright public ones, but the narrow, self-effacing spans that knew how to keep a secret. There was a bridge made from the line where moonlight becomes not moonlight, a silver edge that walks across fields during the night as dependably as a farmer checks the gate. Odin would step onto that line and stroll the border, his palms open as if balancing a tray, and the earth would tell him which seeds were already practicing being bred. Another bridge appeared in the last quiet inside an echo after the loud part had introduced itself and before the room remembered its own opinions. He would cross that quiet and hear what tomorrow had decided about the weather. He did not ask more than a day could say without blushing. He took exactly the right amount of knowledge, the way you take exactly one pancake from a stack so the rest settle happily into place. Sometimes he built the bridge out of grammar. Prophets speak in tenses that behave like well-trained dogs. Stay, heal, bring. When a seer whispered a sentence that was nearly true, Odin placed his heel on the almost and his toe on the soon, and the sentence became firm enough to carry him. He liked the conjunction meanwhile best. Meanwhile is the kind of word that sets out extra cups without being asked, and a meanwhile can support 3 calm strides enough to reach a useful overlook. From there he could watch the day arriving on the back of a gullible breeze, and the breeze, feeling important, would arrange itself so that lost travelers found their hats. On winter nights he read the minutes of frost. This is bureaucratic work, and he was good at it. Frost writes reports in tidy angles along the fence rails, the status of ponds, the ambition of puddles, a list of which shadows intend to be longer in the afternoon. He walked along those thin white letters, the way a scribe walks along a shelf of scrolls, and he learned small futures that don't mind being known tea that will cool at a helpful speed, bridges that prefer humming to creaking, a barn door that will swing without taking offense. Prophecy was rarely thunder in his hands. It was housekeeping with the lights dimmed, a chair moved half a thumb's width to keep shins content. A nail turned the smallest degree so rain would choose a gentler path down. A promise phrase so it fits the mouth without biting. He kept a pouch of such adjustments. That is the real currency at the edge of fate, the ravens, who collect trivia the way pockets collect lint, wrote it all down in their ledger. They avoided names and filled the margins with comments such as, "Today he stood on a rumor until it became a walkway," and "He smiled at the ice so politely that it remembered how to hold." Once they recorded with smug beaks, Odin paid the toll on a bridge that does not charge tolls, which he did because gratitude pays better than coin. Bridges love to be thanked. A bridge that has been thanked will hold its breath at the right moment for the rest of its life. Eclipses were good for long journeys. When the sun and moon argued softly over the same chair, an even gray stairway appeared across the fields. Odin walked up those steps and down the far side of the commotion until time forgot to put a fence in front of him. There he could stroke future hours like cats and check their fur for stags. If an hour seemed likely to catch on a nail an argument at noon, a plate discovering gravity too suddenly, he filed the nail and patted the hour back into the line. You can do a lot of good with a file and a tone of voice that assumes everyone means well. Then there were 2 bridges. At dawn the world writes in droplets on blades of grass, messages about patience and the day's preferred temperature. Odin set his boot on the sentence that said, "Walk gently here," then on the next that said, "The lake will act like a mirror until 3, and finally on the instruction, "Leave crumbs for the small people with 6 legs." Obeyed all 3 and was rewarded with a view of the afternoon strolling toward him at a pace that made sense. He waved. The afternoon waved back, surprised, as if caught without its cloak, and the weather blushed into fairness. He spoke with roots as a matter of routine. A root knows the future of stability better than anyone else. He would lean against the bark of a spruce that had been working at the same project for a century and listen as the bark told him which way snow chooses to fall when it is in a thoughtful mood. He did not take notes because writing during prophecy feels like laughing in church. Instead, he arranged the knowledge into pockets of the mind where it would not startle the rest. He understood that futures are skittish creatures. They prefer a hand extended sideways, palm low, as if offering something without looking directly at it. The Norns, who weave data into destiny, appreciated this discretion. At Urd's well, he never asked for a headline. He requested the smaller print at the bottom, the part about recommended care, the part that explains not to leave a prophecy in direct sunlight or near a kennel of unrested dogs. He laid a finger on the edge of the loom and felt the vibration of 1,000 lives going about their errands. If a thread pulled too tight, he added a whisper to the air, "Leave room." If a thread sagged with the heaviness of a decision that wasn't ready, he made the tiniest wane to cradle it so the weight would not feel like blame. The Norns did not look up. That was their way of saying thank you. It is possible to be colleagues with inevitability if you bring your own needle. There is a rumor, one of the tidy ones, already folded at the corners, that he once walked along a line of candle smoke to hear what an unborn winter meant by mild. The smoke made a bridge like handwriting you could balance on. He placed his feet carefully in the loops and learned that mild wanted more blue shadows and fewer loud Tuesdays. This is not what people expect winters to say, which is why we hire professionals to ask. He arranged for the blue shadows by placing a respectful suggestion in the pockets of several mountains, and he shortened the Tuesdays by persuading bells to agree on a more measured enthusiasm. When he supervised the future's gentle construction, he used tools that look like courtesy. A coil of quiet string to tie one likely outcome to another with a label, "Either is fine." A small tin of oil for squeaky hinges and an hour an apology offered to the hinge in its own language. A pocket mirror in which a prophecy could see its face and decide whether it was ready for public breakfast. He traveled light. He believed too much gear makes a fate feel cornered. The best bridges for divination were built from attention, already being paid. Two shepherds turn their heads at the same moment and watch the first star. Their twin gazes become a wire in the air, humming faintly with routine. Odin could walk their share, looking for the length of a song, and hear where the star intended to be tomorrow. A grandmother counted stitches every evening in the light of a reluctant lamp. The counting laid a neat footpath across weeks. He stepped along that arithmetic and felt where the cloth would end, and he made sure there was enough wool left over for a hat, exactly when a hat would be the kind of mercy that makes a day. Forget its sharp corners, dreams lent bridges generously. When a sleeper rolled onto the middle of the bed, a trough formed in the mattress. Along that valley, intentions marched like patient ants. He joined the procession for 3 strides and memorized which good idea was going to wake up first. He never tampered. He simply adjusted a curtain so the dawn would arrive as a suggestion rather than a declarative sentence. People woke thinking they had finally solved something ordinary, where to hang the pan so it doesn't sound offended every morning, and that was enough. Prophecy has an undeserved reputation for high drama. In practice, it is mostly a matter of showing up early to the meeting and stacking the chairs into friendlier shapes. You might imagine he counted comets. He did, occasionally, but comets are flamboyant and get bored unless you admire them out loud. He saved his admiration for potholes that had remembered, all on their own, how to be shallower by spring. He complimented the potholes, and they improved by a surprising decimal. Count that as an omen if you like. The ravens did. They scribbled, "Today, the hole in the road made promises and kept them," and hopped down the page. There were signs he would not use. He distrusted omens that arrived wearing too much jewelry. A red sky with opinions about sailors is acceptable. A red sky that hands you a resume is not. He liked signals that understood their size, moss that picked one side of a rock as its favored address, ice that warned in quiet hieroglyphs, bread that rose with the optimism appropriate to bread. In their company, he could treat prophecy as a neighborly chore. He would look in on the coming week, set an extra place at the table for luck, even if it had already sent regrets, and nudge the hour with the spilled sugar toward the broom that didn't mind extra work when the bridges led him to somber places, caves that searched the air, shores where fog does paperwork. He carried calm in his pockets like lint. He pressed a piece of calm into the crack of a stone, not enough to change geology, just enough to make echoes more forgiving. He left calm on a step that would meet a tricky heel, on the lip of a cup that might tremble near prophecy with too many syllables, on a door latch that always remembered to be brisk when briskness was dignity. The future soft by a fraction and fit better. Solstices made long, careful ramps. On the shortest day, the year itself leans to tie its shoe, and Odin walked along the bend of that lean, hand on the curve like a staircase rail. He met Winter's plan halfway. Less bite, he suggested, more crisp. Winter liked the phrasing and practiced it. On the longest day, he paced along a surplus of light, removing bits of glare that would only have frightened swallows and made puddles think above their station. He saved the extra light in a jar the size of a teacup. If you hold such a jar near your ear in February, you can hear grass rehearsing. He liked to leave breadcrumbs for other travelers in the prophecy country. Small instructions that don't smell like instructions. Here the ground enjoys flattery, one note implied, and the next day a sensible person would find kind words rising to their tongue uninvited. You're doing very well. Path. And the path, praised by a stranger, would express its gratitude by being slightly less slippery. He did not sign his notes. He let the bridge take the credit. Bridges are at their best when they think of themselves as generous. The strangest bridge he ever used strange only because it was so ordinary was the shared pause in 100 kitchens where lids click and nobody speaks for 2 heartbeats. That pause is wide enough to carry a man if he has garlanded himself with patience. He stepped from kitchen to kitchen in that quiet, and he heard what households planned without knowing they were planning. Someone would forgive someone, not extravagantly, but with a clean countertop. Someone would decide not to buy an absurdly large onion. Someone would send a letter that did not require a reply, and another person would keep the letter on a shelf for years until it learned to be a blessing. He came away with the impression that the world could be trusted for another season, which is the best kind of a UGRY. His conversation with animals about what is about to be is courteous and minor. With cows, he discussed shade. With foxes, the availability of shortcuts in the evening. With tired horses, the weather's plans for the joints that serve as hinges on their dignified legs. He promised nothing. He said, "I will ask," and the air, overhearing, rearranged a cloud or lengthened a breeze as if it had meant to all along. He walked on air like that when the bridge was shy, making sure not to leave footprints in the thin places where people come to wish without witnesses. If you find yourself awake when you meant to be asleep, you can use his method. Notice the thin line where the room becomes not room, the part just beyond your elbow where air is deciding whether to be a blanket. Imagine that line becoming a slow walkway. Step with your attention onto the word, almost, then place the other foot on the word, already. Walk 3 breaths. The bed approves. It enjoys being a dock for small crossings. If you are still awake, feel free to subscribe to the habit of not rushing. It costs less than a coin, more than a shrug. He never finished a prophecy. That is an important rule. He read enough to arrange kindness and then folded the rest back into its page. Futures like being folded and set gently where they can keep whispering to themselves. He left them with food crumbs of respect and the occasional polished truth, so they would not snack on fear out of boredom. Once, after listening to a week decide who would get the last apple, he cut the apple into slices of equal possibility and told the week to share. It did, and the week tasted of something you could call civility. The bridges that carried him to such listening have not vanished. They simply prefer people who announce nothing. If you walk beside a hedge at the hour when the day ties up its apron strings, you may feel a place where the air holds you more carefully than air usually does. That is a bridge. If you count the steps to your door and the number comes out different from yesterday, but you still feel on time, that is a bridge too. They are everywhere the future is learning to be reasonable. Odin used them to read what he needed. Then he thanked them, and the thanks made them want to exist again. Some evenings he sat on the rail of a prophecy and watched minnows practice being larger fish. They were very serious about it. He approved. He had a way of stepping off a forecast sideways, so it would not feel stepped on, and then he went down by the mill to adjust the attitude of a wheel with a kind word about endurance. He opened a window in a cottage to let out a prediction that had become stuffy. He moved a broom so it would be found without searching. The large threads in the loom of what must be went on exactly as they must. The small ones, smoothed, permitted comfort, and the night, which notices everything but mentions little, noticed him crossing and recrossing these modest spans, and it imitated his footsteps, low and regular. Even now, when starlight files the sky into finer patience, a bridge appears between a worry and its first yawn. The ravens record it as they always do. Tonight, a question went to bed on time and tucked their beaks into their feathers. The well at the roots of the world answers itself with the smallest ripple, somewhere on the line where light agrees to become not light for a while. A road considers becoming helpful and does again, carrying someone who is not trying and who therefore arrives exactly where the next easy breath is waiting. You might expect that when the end of days comes knocking, bridges would crack like thunder and fling sparks into the sky. But the old stories say something much sleepier happened first. The paths simply began to lose interest. A railing forgot how to hold a shadow. A plank decided to take a day off and then discovered with relief that days off could be extended indefinitely. It was how a shop closes when the last customer is already home. The latch turned, the lamps dimmed, someone wiped the counter twice because the cloth was soft. That's how the vanishing started, with a patient tiding. If you're still awake later, you can keep me company as I wander along the edges of these disappearing crossings. Or you can let the lids drift down, and I'll keep to the easy pace, pausing now and then so sleep can find you without hurrying. The first to notice, of course, were the roots at the base of the world tree. They're not philosophers, but they are excellent record keepers. They felt a certain looseness near the little footbridges that used to let foxes pass from one bark road to another. The roots reported, in their slow way, that some spans seemed to have misplaced their weight. A bridge that had always known the exact number of footsteps it liked each day began to prefer fewer. It wasn't offended. There was no letter to management. It just developed a taste for quiet, the way you develop a taste for tea with a slightly longer steep. Frost confirmed this in its daily minutes, written in careful angles on fence rails. Bridge on the second stream practicing absence. No complaints from the water. The water, for its part, enjoyed the new freedom to lean where it pleased. It sighed into hollows and made small inventories of stones. The stones rolled their shoulders. Some of them had been holding up important crossings for centuries, and they appreciated the chance to think less about posture. Travelers adjusted almost without noticing. Messengers folded their roots like linen and found that a missing span meant a detour past a good berry patch. Hunters discovered the narrow board that once offered a shortcut through reeds, now offered an opinion about retirement. And the reeds, without supervision, sang quietly to themselves about birds and the weather. A sailor putting in at a rickety pier that led into an elf road, if you knew how to keep your gaze politely imprecise, found only fog. Not an alarming fog, the kind that settles its bill and leaves a tip. He concluded the elves had stepped into a later appointment and decided to do the same, which is exactly the kind of conclusion the world seemed to prefer as things drew toward their closing chapters. The rest, the bright showpiece, did not vanish first. It is difficult to stop a rainbow from being the center of attention, but even there, kindly maintenance signs appeared. The colors faded by polite degrees, as if someone were turning a dimmer switch so slowly they expected you might not mind. Red agreed to be more of a suggestion. Yellow chose to rest its eyes. Blue, always the professional, kept a small corridor open for urgent business, which in those days mostly meant delivering reminders to gods who had left their helmets on windowsills. The gatekeepers stamped fewer tickets and kept the stamp oiled. It is an underappreciated skill, oiled stamps at the end of the world. They make the last paperwork feel considerate dot where the lesser crossings used to. Hide those little private arches the trolls built out of fog and bone. The thread-like walkways woven by the elves out of starlight and a willingness to be quiet. There were early hints. The troll's fog preferred to sleep in. It hung under the willows until noon and could not be persuaded to rise into useful shapes. People said, with the affection one reserves for fog, it has its reasons, and decided there were other, slower ways across. Elven paths did what old songs sometimes do. They remembered the melody but forgot most of the words. You would step into the blue-white shimmer and find yourself humming a tune that held your feet in place instead of carrying them on. No harm done. You simply listened until the song finished its thought, then went home by the long, reasonable way along a lake that did not mind reflecting your hat. Some bridges chose to reduce their opening hours. The narrow stone path that used to meet a ravine at a handsome angle began to appear only during practical weather. It declared itself closed in the middle of overstimulated winds and became very strict about lunch. People found it sensible. In truth, there are many errands you do not need to run in the teeth of a cross breeze. There was a kindly bridge keeper, a woman with a shawl that knew how to mind its own castles, who stood at that stone path and told each traveler, "You are welcome to go around today. The view has been informed and will wait." She had a stamp too, with a small picture of patience on it, and if you presented the stamp at the next village, you received a cup of something warm. Not because coupons existed, because people liked participating in a shared experiment and slowness. Odin noticed, as he notices anything that tries to be subtle, and he did not argue. He had spent years walking bridges made from moonlight and grammar, and he knew the vocabulary for endings that don't wish to be loud. He walked with his hands behind his back and let the closing span speak. A bridge told him, in the creak of one board and the mellow of one nail, that it had carried enough sacks of barley, enough careful feet, enough rumors. He thanked it as one thanks a chair that has done its duty in a long meeting. He removed a small wedge from its pocket, the wedge that had kept it at attention, and placed the wedge on a shelf of air-labeled. Soon, the bridge sighed with the softest dignity and turned itself into a memory so smooth that people could slide along it while thinking of other things. The Norns, who know about volume control for destiny, were weaving thinner threads for the crossing places. Not snap threads, not knots thrown in anger, simply strands with a touch more willingness to release. The loom hummed at a slower rotation, enough that an attentive ear could hear a song in the machinery. If you leaned close, you could make out the lyrics, which were mostly instructions for tiding. Stack the promises so they do not fall. Label the boxes kept and intended. Wrap the broken vows in paper that does not scratch the hands. Bridges love such songs. They were built by people who understood that wood beams sleep better when doors are latched and boots are left where they can be found in the morning dot. Meanwhile, prophecies began to underpromise. Eclipses still spread a gray stairway across fields, but the stairs were narrower, like those in a lighthouse where you pace yourself because the view will not be hurried. Odin walked them with respect and came home with forecasts that were almost domestic. Expect fewer grand entrances, one prophecy advised. Expect more dignified exits, preferably through the kitchen, where the latch is quieter. Another remarked, several important meetings have decided to be letters. Instead, there were still big pronouncements somewhere on the shelf, but even they seemed to prefer being spoken in the tone used to discuss the weathers. Harmless decisions about cloud shapes, birds, who keep immaculate ledgers, adjusted their notes. The ravens recorded, bridge over the third stream reduced to a rumor. No injuries, opinions mixed, general acceptance. They also scribbled, shortcut behind the hay barn now goes only halfway. Remaining distance supplied by a pleasant smell of apples. You could tell they enjoyed the assignment. Everything that becomes a rumor feels lighter in the beak. There was a small scandal when a rumor insisted it had never been a bridge at all, but an exceptionally cooperative patch of wind. The ravens entered a footnote, wind requesting recognition, and then, as ravens do, they looked satisfied with the bureaucracy of it. The giants, who long ago built hushed crossings from bone and stone, found their old handiwork deciding to be commentary instead of infrastructure. A rib arch that once helped a traveler over a chasm now served as a museum note about the chasm. Here's where you might have crossed. Kindly observe instead. People did. They stood with their lunches and observed, and the chasm, being shy, did not make a scene. It simply shelved its echoes and kept the cool for later. A boulder that had been a step for centuries lay down and practiced being part of the view. Children patted it. The boulder had never been patted with such regularity, and privately considered this an upgrade. On the elven side of things, light developed boundaries. Starlit paths that used to stretch like silver ribbons between birch trunks now stayed within polite frames. The way a painting respects its own edges. The elves didn't mind. Frames are a kind of invitation to admire. Sailors who had once caught a glimpse of a walkway combing the surface of a lake now watched the same light refresh the moon's hair. The effect was still beautiful, only less persuasive. You could see the glamour setting out chairs instead of setting out a table. It feels wonderful in the last seasons to be asked only to sit and watch. The human maps took a hint and began trimming, not aggressively. One cartographer put a small, careful X through a dotted line and wrote, in tidy runes, "Path has decided to be a legend." Another turned an old bridge symbol into a drawing of a reclining cat. He explained to anyone who asked that the cat represented a nap across which no one should step. This was adopted widely. Soon there were cats sleeping across fjords, across forests, across tiny streams that required no cat at all. The cats slept on, and people felt they had been given permission to take the ferry, or take their time, or take a sandwich and agree that the other bank would still be there tomorrow. Lemire grew more serious with the approach of Ragnarok. Detailers call it doom. But even doom can prefer soft shoes. The vanishing gathered itself. Some plank paths faded from the center outward, like a yawn deciding which muscles it knows. Others blurred at the edges until the middle lost its nerve and followed. There were no falls into chasms reported by respectable sources. Nothing in the world wanted that kind of theater. Feet paused, found grass, and continued at ground level, which always had more to say than we think. The grass explained local matters, thistle families, ant projects, the itinerary of a beetle whose work ethic put everyone at ease. By the time you had listened to the grass for a dozen strides, you were where you meant to be. Without the fuss of crossing, there were farewells that felt like thank you notes. A wooden bridge over a cheerful stream called people close for just one more season, imprinted their footsteps with the smell of sap, as if to send everyone away with souvenirs made of air. Another, a rope bridge with a distinguished squeak, gradually trained the squeak to be a lullaby. Traders crossing for the last time found themselves humming, and the humming wrapped around their bundles so the pots and knives did not click. A final courtesy. You could imagine a meeting of bridges somewhere in the practical dark where they agreed on a uniform soft voice, less glare, generous patience, and wore it impeccably to the end. The priests made notes in the margins of their calendars. Expect reductions in obvious miracles, they wrote, accompanied by increases in smaller mercies. Faint paths through marshes refused to carry armies, but were happy to carry one tired father home before night. Snow bridges spanning the creases of winter announced they would accept only children and poems, and the children and poems crossed in companionable pairs, admiring each other's hats. There's always a hat at the end of the world, someone said, and everyone agreed. Hats have the right idea about dignity without trouble. As the great cracks arrived far away, slow and inevitable as glacier advice, the small places went on with their particular kindness. A ferry rope that had stretched across a sleepy river for 100 years let go, but it let go when both banks had already agreed not to be impatient. People found the rope later, laid in a careful coil by the wind. Someone put a loaf of bread in the center, as if to say, "We are still in the habit of feeding the middle," on a hillside path. The milestone that always exaggerated the distance decided to tell the truth for a change. Not far, it admitted in lichen. Travelers patted it and told each other the milestone had matured. Much was made of those who stepped out onto a familiar crossing and discovered only mist, only light, only the same air as everywhere else. They did not fall into nothing. They arrived in the comfortable knowledge that they could turn back or go forward and put their weight on ground that had not been asked to be fancy. Some sat down, consulted the smaller maps that live in pockets and palms, and found that lunch could count as progress. Others remember that in childhood, every tree root was a bridge as long as you declared it so. They declared, crossed, and laughed in the contained way that keeps the birds from thinking you are bragging. The birds approved and took down the minutes. Several citizens successfully crossed via imagination. Laughter tidy. No disputes. Toward the last, the bridges spoke to each other the way good furniture speaks. Through a sequence of agreeable creaks, a span in the north thanked a span in the west for sharing a certain design that accommodated boots with absent-minded males. A city bridge complimented a forest bridge on its tolerance for moss. The forest bridge, which had always liked moss as a personality trait, sent back a small mat of green as a visiting card. The city bridge tried the mat near its one remaining lamp, and found the lamp looked gentler for the company. Seeing this, people began placing sprigs of something friendly on the places that were leaving. Not offerings, exactly. More like reminders that being fond is dignified. This is how the old tales describe the thinning of the ways when Ragnar came nearer. Not smashing, not the kind of drama you have to look at with your whole face, but the modest winding down of a carefully kept shop. The sign in the window turned to closing soon, thank you. The clerk swept without raising dust. A regular slipped in to buy a final spool of thread and was told, "Take two, we're using up the last of the paper bags." Outside, the road was still the road. Travelers still had places to be, which they reached with the ordinary grace of legs and patience. Those who missed the high crossings found they could take comfort in low ones made of reeds and good manners. Those who had always preferred the ferry did not have to change a thing. If you are still with me, consider the small, unremarkable spans near you. The doorway you step over every morning is a bridge between unmade bed and brewed coffee. Should it ever resign, you will still find a way to the kettle. The way people found a way across when brighter paths turned themselves into stories. The throw rug that offers a dignified crossing over a stripe of cold tile is a winter bridge, and if it decides to retire, the floor will learn to be a little warmer where you like to stand. These are the quiet truths that old end times kept telling anyone who wished to listen without anxiety. Most crossings can be replaced by kindness, patience, or a slight change of route. Some say that when the last small path winked out, a thread of starlight over a ditch that had been too polite to call itself one, the night applauded with soft wings. Others say it made no noise at all. It simply kept attending to its usual work of cooling roofs and nudging owls. Either way, nothing rushed. The world, so close to its great turning, kept the tone of a library at closing time. One more page. One more borrowed thought returned to its shelf. One more light switched off with the consideration of someone who knows others are resting. And still the ground was underfoot, and still the air was learnable. And still there were the old habits of going and coming back, of carrying bread, of wearing a good hat, of writing a note on a scrap of cloud that said, "Took the long way, pleasant, will be along," and pinning it where the day could smile at the message, and not worry. We can walk beside those endings for a few breaths longer, if you like. The path is here while we are speaking of it, because attention is a small, dependable carpenter. It lays down a plank, then another, steady as counting sheep that have learned their numbers. The rails are made of the hour's own patience. When your eyes drift closed, the bridge will decide it has done enough, and it will put itself away, neatly with the others. Somewhere at the base of the world tree, a root will note the neatness and approve with the measured nod that root systems give. A raven will write in its tidy ledger, crossing concluded without incident, listener comfortable, night agreeable, and the last of the colors will tuck themselves under the dark like quilts, and the remaining spans will hold the silence together the way good stitching holds a hem, while the rest of the story goes on, at the speed of a breath that has chosen the long way home. You might expect a legend about people who never came back to sound loud and tragic, but the old Norse stories handle it like someone setting a teacup on a windowsill and leaving it there to warm in the sun. The travelers simply stepped onto certain soft-looking paths and discovered that the other side was not in a hurry to be reached. Their names didn't vanish. They just started keeping slower hours. A shepherd boy followed a violet shimmer over a ditch and began showing up only in his flock's dreams, tiding their wool. A hunter crossed a plank that smelled faintly of pine tar and now appears on foggy mornings to recommend which boots are kindest to feet. There is a hush to it all, a library tone. If you're still awake in a minute or two, you're welcome to stay with me as we loiter by these stories. Or if your pillow has started explaining its plans for the night, you can let it win. I'll keep the pace easy, the way a river pretends it has nowhere else to be. The legends began in modest places. At the edge of a potato field, beside a rope ferry that wasn't feeling ambitious, under a stand of ash where the roots wrote their long notes in the soil. An old woman says her brother walked into a stripe of moonlight because the stripe looked extremely persuasive, like a freshly made bed. He waved once with a hand that always remembered to carry twine. She insists she has never worried. She can still hear him everywhere twine is needed. Once, in a storm, she found her gutter mysteriously repaired with something that felt like braided weather. She told the neighbors it was only practical for a person to become useful in more directions. The neighbors agreed. In a corner of the same village, a baker's apprentice followed a two-board bridge that appeared only when the oven's thermometer pointed to stew, and now the yeast rises in a more confident way that everyone attributes to him. The baker leaves out a small roll every night as if to tip a waiter for good service. In the morning, the roll is gone, and the baker receives, in exchange, a dream where dough explains its favorite temperature. No one complains about the barter. Ravens record these things in a tidy script. They do not say lost, they say redirected. Redirected one fisherman. Previously of the South Pier, the ledger reads, now a regular breeze that tells the sails when patience will be rewarding. Another entry logs a child who pursued a skipping stone across a brook and found the stone skipping upwards. The child is noted as freelance advisor to trout on where the interesting bugs sit. The birds are not sentimental, just thorough, and they like that some fates can be written with the same pen that writes about weather. You do not need special ink for a legend that chooses to be helpful dot far away. In the soft margins of night where the elven paths once kept their appointments, the stories become almost domestic. A woodcutter followed a line of starlight that leaned across a pond like a polite handshake. He never returned to chop. Yet every autumn his wife found the woodpiles stacked in a style that only he used, with the little air gaps he swore kept wood cheerful. She smelled juniper on the handles of the axes and decided not to ask questions the knight would feel obliged to answer. When people pressed her for details, she said, "He is on errand," which is a good phrase for a life that keeps choosing errands of a longer kind. The elves, who rarely explain themselves, are rumored to favor such marriages, one partner in the kitchen with a kettle that knows its responsibilities. The other in the almost place where dew keeps minutes, no one minds reading slowly. Troll-built, bridges get their own gentle legends. There is a pair of hunters who used to brag about crossing one of those bone and stone arches in thick fog, and then one morning they were simply done bragging. Not silenced, just finished with the project. The gossip says they became the fog's sense of direction. On days when it sticks to the hills like cling film, you can feel a courteous tug that says, "Left a bit, good. Now there is a warm hut with soup. People, call the hut the hunter's soup, and leave a ladle out like a lighthouse." Trolls, who disapprove of fuss but approve of tradition, granted their approval and signed the rock with a neat scratch that looks like a sleepy grin dot. Of course, the Great Rainbow Bridge. Bifrost keeps the most famous disappearances, though even there the tone is very far from tragic. Skalds tell of a harpist who practiced under the lowest stripe, just to borrow tone quality and One evening slipped into the collar and discovered it had steps. The harpist is said to have become an inspector of echo, a modest position with excellent benefits. Thanks to this appointment, echoes along fjords adopted a friendly punctuality, arriving just when you hope a story you told aloud might come back to pat you on the shoulder. On rare bright days, people swear they hear a string being tuned exactly where the horizon begins to yawn. The harpist's old cat naps on the doorstep as if someone still needs a doorman. Here and there, pathstones kept their own memories of the travelers who didn't return and developed small habits of loyalty. A particular slab near a barley field warms itself at sunrise as if waiting for the millers. Apprentice who once danced on it before running errands. Sometimes a passerby, without meaning to, copies the dance and discovers the day is easier afterward, like a jar that suddenly opens after you stop trying. The slab is not magical in the exciting sense. It merely participates in a teamwork that includes gravity, posture, and the willingness to let one hip join the conversation. A legend can be like that, less a thunderclap, more a helpful adjustment to how you carry a basket. The Norns who weave do not issue press releases about those who step out of the schedule, but spinners and farmhouses insist the loom tells tailies if you work late. A spool will run slightly slow, as if listening, and the thread will pick up a hint of another person's rhythm. That is how one family noticed their grandfather had chosen a road that the map preferred not to show. The cloth they wove that winter had his laugh in its selvage. It is said the blanket made from that cloth will not slip off a sleeping child, not even the athletic ones who kick and negotiate like minor gods. Practical magic is still magic. The Norns do not comment. They simply write in the subtle grammar of warp and weft, present, elsewhere. Some of the never returns are less romantic and more like finding a cupboard that goes on slightly longer than you expected. There is a story about a clerk brace of pens in his pocket, nobly devoted to ink, that took a side path behind a market stall to avoid a puddle and never came back by the front door. Now and then, tax rolls balance themselves without resentment. Receipts arrive that smell faintly of juniper and honest rain. The market women agree that the clerk finally achieved the office he always wanted, the quiet desk between numbers and fairness. If you leave a sensible pencil on the stall rail, it vanishes by morning. Everyone behaves as though the pencil had a better offer. Then there are the feasts. The most yawn-friendly of the sagas swear that some travelers who disappeared simply reach tables that go on, covered with soups that refill themselves and breads that express gratitude when butter meets them. A warrior who chased a path of sparks into a cave now supervises the pepper, which can be headstrong. A sheepdog that followed its master onto a narrow green bar of light is said to patrol under the benches, herding crumbs toward the people who need them. No one worries what happens after dessert. The story shuts the door gently so the warmth stays in, and we shrug, content to assume that somewhere there is a place doing hospitality at scale. The ravens have a footnote about it. They think the ladle sizes are excessive but concede the efficiency. A few of the never returns became bridges themselves, which sounds dramatic until you notice how it's described. A shy man from a coastal village was renowned for a competence that refused applause. When he followed a frost-silver plank into what locals call the better part of the fog, boatmen later found a crossing where none had been. It was not made of stone or wood, but of the exact feeling you get when someone wordlessly hands you the other end of a heavy thing. You stepped onto that feeling and arrived, and afterward your coat remembered how to do its job. People said the man had graduated into his natural subject. They celebrated him by sharpening their knives quietly and helping neighbors tie knots that faced the right way. Children appear often in these legends because children are good at accepting invitations that the day didn't know it had sent. A girl walking home with wild onions saw a line of brightness the size of a jump rope and treated it accordingly. She hopped into a meadow that later could not be located on the local maps. The onions she left behind replanted themselves politely, and the next spring grew in the shape of her favorite letter. Parents in the area tell their children that the girl became a lighthouse for birds. Not a tall one, just a precise glimmer that says, "Here is the safe turn." It is an unproblematic job. The girl's mother claims the laundry dries faster on Tuesdays, which she attributes to a competent daughter with control of certain breezes. You might wonder if anyone ever regretted stepping into the long errand. The stories are very calm about this. One or two mention a return for a single chore. A young man who became a custodian of quiet bridges is said to appear once a year to flip the mattress on his mother's bed, because a promise is a promise. Another story tells of a woman who worked in a weaving house. She supposedly slipped into a starlit hallway and later came back only to collect the thimble she'd forgotten. The thimble was left out for her on a dish that used to hold plum stones. In the morning it was gone, and the plum tree, which had been coy, produced an admirable crop. Considerations like this are why the Never Returned are not a sad club. They are a society of people who still make sure you find your scarf when it is cold dot, as Ragnarok drew nearer, and the official bridges grew modest. These legends multiplied like blankets in a cedar chest. The world did not approve of new tragedies. It preferred familiar kindnesses. A traveling skald sang a lazy tune about a carpenter who vanished while testing the balance of a beam. Now, it is rumored, if you set a table and it does not wobble, you owe the carpenter a piece of cheese. He accepts either kind goat or cow, and is said to use the rind to smooth out troublesome breezes. People leave a corner of cheese on windowsills, and mice, touched by the arrangement, write small, appreciative notes in their own handwriting on the margins of newspapers. The notes are mostly about the value of routine dot, and then there are the stories of guardianship, the ones that say the missing did not go far at all, only sideways. A rower becomes the hand that steadies the ferry rope when the river is unconvincing. A seamstress becomes the invisible thread that keeps a rope ladder from sulking. A wayfinder becomes the bright idea that arrives in your mind as you are about to turn down the wrong lane. The guardians never interfere loudly. They do not shout. They prefer to give the kind of nudge you can mistake for your own competence. That is the whole point. The world wanted to end in a way that made people feel useful right up to bedtime. The last of the legends concerns a man who is very fond of collecting small, unnecessary objects that nonetheless promised future cleverness buttons, washers, a hinge that a careful person could not throw away. He set out across a beam the width of a thought and did not come back, which some assumed meant he had found a warehouse for possible usefulness. Afterward, when doors closed with a kinder click and saddles stopped believing they were entitled to squeak, people nodded to his memory. They said he had finally become the place where odds and ends learn their manners. If you keep a kitchen drawer of interesting maybes, you are participating in his cult. No ceremonies required. Just the relief of tightening a screw with exactly the right leftover piece. If you're still listening, that means the legends are doing what they always do, turning themselves into a light under the blanket rather than a torch in the street. They do not hurry you toward conclusions. They lower the stovetop and put the soup on simmer. They remind you that even the stories of those who never stepped home again are filled with common courtesies, fixed hinges, folded laundry, freshly stacked wood, feathers that point the way in fog. There is no final speech, only an ongoing service industry run by the kind of people who bring you water before you ask and who know when to leave the bill face down. Somewhere, a ledger closes for the night with a neat line. Redirected travelers continue to assist. Somewhere else, a set of little footsteps in dust stops at a bright doorway and becomes the pattern by which future dust learns to settle. We could linger a while at the edge of one of those almost paths. It is more suggestion than bridge, a smudge of glow where two grasses agree to part for a footfall. The air smells like baked stones cooling on a windowsill. If you step onto it, you will not vanish. You will only remember the names of places whose names are yawns. The path is not trying to impress. It is offering you the same appointment that so many took, and from which they sent back better weather. Organized tools, kinder echoes. You might stay, or you might go back to the chair with the comfortable dent. Either way, the story can idle here, like a boat that understands that a river is also a pillow. The night files its careful papers. A raven signs with a feather that has perfected understatement. And somewhere just beyond the fence, someone who followed a stripe of light straighter than string adjusts the angle of the moon by the width of a spoon. So the bridge of sleep can find you, and you can cross without noticing, and the legend can continue off to one side. Content to be helpful, content to repeat, as long as it takes.